Chapter 4. Amazing Grace. John read his father's letter from Mr. Manesti, chewing on each letter. It was a letter I wrote a few months ago when I was leaving as governor of Fort York in the New World. His father's warm love has been passed on to him. He even mentioned his mother, who died for the first time in 16 years. John bought a carriage ticket and decided to visit the Catlets. Polly's family welcomed him. Polly grew taller and was no longer a girl. He bloomed with maturity that would take your breath away. But she treated John as if she were her brother, not a loved one. John wanted to hug Polly, but she kept her distance to keep her cool. She stayed the night and had to leave the next morning. 6 weeks later, the slave ship Brownlow docked off the coast of Sierra Leone, where John had previously worked as a slave for Clow. A low African drum could be heard from the interior. John's heart raced. Memories from Africa clamored in the mind. As he resumed his voyage, his passion for godly living cooled. There were no Christian colleagues to share and encourage. When he arrived in Africa, his old habits slipped back. Fighting the lusts of his heart, he gave up his conscience, went down to his lower deck, unchained the young African woman, and unleashed his lust. While the ship is moored there, John and the captain are invited by Clow to spend a few days at his house. "Ah, Mr. Newton, you look very good." "Yes, very good." John's fear of his old enemies faded as the wine passed by. Clow and Pi were surprised by John's confidence and even looked at him with admiration. At night John opened the bedroom door and entered, standing in the soft light of the lamp, Ruby, a familiar old love. One day, a few days after that, John's whole body lost strength and hallucinatory symptoms appeared. It felt that death was not far away. His life was now again like an extinguished flame. He recalled his memory. He also thought about the storm, how he called on God to rescue him, and how his life changed after his conversion. But he didn't seem to have changed much. He was still a sinner committing great sins as before. He saw a vision while he was in a daze. He had Jesus on the cross and he himself was crucifying the wrists and feet of Jesus Christ. Then John heard what Jesus said on the cross. "I already died for you, so why do you crucify me again?" John watched as Jesus drew his last breath and his head fell helplessly onto his chest. John barely came to his senses and got out and crawled ashore. He sat down as if collapsing on the sand. "God, forgive me. I crucified Jesus again. Lord, take my life. Bury me in the sea, amen." After praying with all his heart, he was completely exhausted and fell asleep with his head resting against a rock. For more than an hour John lay there motionless. Even when the tide reached his waist, he did not regain consciousness. Before long, seawater came up to his ears and mouth. But the water level stopped rising there and started going down again. John came to his senses by the time the beach was dry again. When he opened his eyes, there was great peace, serenity of soul, and an inner certainty that he would recover and be well again. John slept peacefully that night and returned to the ship the next day in a marked improvement. John was convinced of his faith that God had not forgotten him. As Newton read Paul's epistles, he learned that it was impossible to avoid sinning in one's own strength. He said that only God could. His business was to rely on him and go by his faith alone. The Brownlow, full of slaves, left West Africa and arrived in Liverpool a week before Christmas 1749. Manesti rejoiced at the timely return with a cargo of value as well as gold and silver from the sale of a cargo of slaves. "I will succeed as a captain now." "So, are you ready to command your ship?" "Yes, Captain." "Now we are ready." "Okay, I appoint you as the captain of the Duke of Arzel." Newton began the 200-mile journey to Kesem a few days later. When he met Polly, John fell in love again. She was shining with her innocence and his violent contrasts markedly with his own life. After she ate, she asked John to go for a walk with her. "For the past 7 years, during those long 7 years, I have loved you all the way. I have always been looking forward to marrying you, but the decision is yours. I'm sorry, John, I can't. Why? I, like my brother, have special feelings. But I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I think I'll have to turn it down. All the way back to Liverpool, John was surrounded by disappointment. However, when he visited Kesem again 2 weeks later, he learned the truth about Polly. If irresponsibility is part of my brother's personality, I feared that one day my marriage and family would end up like that. By the way, my dad said that after he left last time, he saw a big change in his brother's life. He said that something seemed to be a turning point in his life. If that's true, I'll reconsider. Polly, I can't change the past, but I believe God has given me a new chance. I swear with all my life that I will never let you down again. As soon as they got married, the newlyweds had to adjust to married life in many ways. As John dealt with life's problems, he felt spiritually challenged. He wrote to his old pastor, Dr. Jennings. Dr. Jennings replied and sent John a collection of sermons and books that might be helpful. He sensed that John was missing something in his life and wanted to satisfy that hunger. May 18th was the day of John's voyage as captain. John feared that his young age, now 26, would undermine his authority. Ironically, he modeled what he learned from his father as a way to build a captain's leadership. John forbade doing anything without the captain's permission. He also strictly forbade the violation of female slaves. On the Sabbath we had a service and most of the sailors just sat there with disgust. The most repulsive sailors were handed over to other battleships for fear of causing a riot. During John's voyage he received a letter from Thomason announcing his father's death. John sat down at the base of a large Bengal tree and wept. They were never close to their father, but in recent years they have begun to find a deep affection for each other. But now the father is dead. The saddest thing is that his father never saw the change in his son's life. The father, Captain Newton, saw nothing but his son's misguided life and life full of rebellious sins. The Duke of Argyll entered Liverpool harbour in October 1751. Reuniting with Polly was almost like the first night. I even bought a house in Liverpool. However, there were no children between the two. When John went to the doctor, he was told that a person with syphilis could not have children. Now you have to pay the price of your former promiscuous life. Sins were forgiven, but the consequences of what had already been done could not be removed. John showered his wife with her affection and unrelenting attention over the next few months, as if to make up for Polly's inability to conceive. In June 1752, the African sailed with a full load of slaves to be taken to the colonies for the first time 6 weeks later. That evening he thought about Ruby the slave. And that thought led me to pray for the slave. Isn't there nothing wrong with praying for them? It was a bold idea. From having such a consciousness, John went down to see them and began to see them as human beings. One day, John was surprised to find that a slave named Owolawi spoke fairly advanced English. Because I am the son of a chief, I studied a lot. One day a white man showed up in our town. We called him Mr. White Man from Scotland. He taught me to read and write. He spoke of the only true God in the world and his son Jesus. All of our people came to follow Jesus. Mr. Whiteman taught us to pray, and he taught us about the Spirit of Jesus fighting against evil spirits and witchcraft. But one day he was murdered. We couldn't learn any more. After that, other white people came in. They lied to us when they said they were followers of Jesus too. They captured us, raped our women, and took us on slave ships. I can't understand. Why do those bad people call themselves followers of Jesus? John spoke to his conscience without saying anything. I am one of those wicked people who call themselves followers of Jesus. I am killing these people. This thought was shocking. Throughout the rest of the voyage, John was troubled by Owolawi's questions. He instructed sailors to treat slaves more humanely, especially women, and not abuse them in any way. John talked a lot with Rabbi May. The African's beliefs were simpler than his own, but John felt that Owolawi was closer to God than he was. May Rabbi and all his slaves were sold to the New World, and the African arrived in Liverpool after a voyage of about 14 months. He spent time talking about the events of his own life while away from Polly. Newton shared with Polly his dissatisfaction with the slave trade and his desire to get out of the brutal and violent business. Then pray to God to give you another job. But they never thought of praying for the abolition of that terrible slave trade itself. It was because he was too deeply immersed in the world to think of changing it. As the departure date for the next voyage neared, John was on deck supervising the loading of the cargo. Then someone called him in a familiar voice. It was Job Lewis. John gave Job Lewis the position of assistant captain. John tried to undo some of his friend's personality and habits that had been misinformed during his few months with Job. I am praying that God will help me undo the terrible thing 10 years ago when I destroyed your faith and taught you to sin. Stop doing that. I never would have experienced the pleasures life has to offer if you hadn't opened my eyes. All week after the ship sailed, Job Lewis deliberately ignored John's orders. His actions became more and more daring, and he insulted female slaves and even stained other sailors. John bargained for a British ship called the Racehorse, which had been abandoned off the coast of Sierra Leone, bought it cheaply, and gave command of the ship to a man who ordered him to follow with more cargo. However, he did not see the Racehorse when the African arrived in the port of Bont. The next day, when the Racehorse came into his sight, he saw John hanging over his ship. "How is it, Taylor?" John asked the first mate. "Sorry. Captain Lewis is dead. It's embarrassing to tell you, but as soon as Captain Lewis left, he got drunk and ran amok and killed a female slave. The other day, he fell ill with a fever, and after swearing at him, he died and was drowned in the sea. He looked like he had a demon in him. He said he knew he was going to hell." That night John wept over the spirit of his old friend. After a while, John fell ill with a fever and was about to die, but his heart was at peace. He passed several days and the fever was gone, but John, whose body was weakened, prayed in front of the cabin and made two petitions. One was to be an instrument of God, and the other was to find another job so that they would no longer engage in the slave trade. It was no coincidence that I met Captain Cleaney around this time. He introduced John to the evangelical faith. The African and the Racehorse arrived at Liverpool Harbour in record time, and the Johns made the most of their short time in Liverpool. Monesti throws a party to celebrate John's next voyage on Lake Severn. During the banquet, however, John suddenly jumped up and fell paralyzed. The doctor diagnosed John with a paralytic attack. Due to the tight deadline, it was inevitable that another captain would depart instead. However, soon after setting sail, news came about the Severn. A bloody slave riot broke out, killing the captain and most of the crew. When Newton recovered, he visited his church to see Pastor Samuel Brewer, who was close to Cleaney and his friend. Pastor Brewer introduced John to two evangelical ministers, George Whitefield and John Wesley. Established pastors criticized Whitefield and Wesley for being too sentimental religiously, but those who listened to the sermons of the two pastors were changed by the strong message. John was amazed to see hundreds of people gather to repent of their sins. Even while people wept and sought God, it was full of quiet purity. John had never had an experience like this. Shortly thereafter, John took a prominent position as an inspector at the British Customs Service, introduced by Monesti. Newton continued to study and read. He gave a public testimony of his conversion, and many people were moved by his dramatic message. A few years later he was appointed chaplain to a little chapel in Olney, and he served with zeal. In addition to his sermons, John discovered through Cleaney that he had a talent for writing and published his autobiography anonymously. The book reached all levels of society and soon became a bestseller not only in the small town of Olney, but throughout England. After meeting and befriending a poet named William Cowper, he collaborated with him to write hymns. One young boy among the Olney saints was particularly interested in John's sermons and events. His name was William Wilberforce. Young William was living with his uncle when his father died suddenly. They often had deep conversations, and Will, moved by Pastor Newton's care and overflowing love, promised a sincere devotion to the Christian faith. However, Will's mother took him away because she did not want him to become religious at such a young age. A few years later, 17-year-old William Wilberforce sent a letter saying that he was attending St. John's College, Cambridge. When he hears from his uncle that Will has fallen into a bad place with his wrong friends, John shakes his head as he thinks of his past. He made it a personal prayer topic for John and Will's life to change. In 1774, John Wesley published a pamphlet criticizing the slave trade, which inspired Newton to speak more openly about his experience and to oppose its brutal economic practices. Newton's voice against the slave trade soon resonated greatly. Newton was now a famous author. Olney's little chapel was filled with believers and travelers who came each week to hear about his life experiences. Friends urged them to move to a larger church, but John and Polly wanted to stay in this quiet place forever. But finally, at the beginning of January 1780, no longer able to refuse, he began his ministry at St. Mary Woolnorth. In 1785, John received a letter from a young 27-year-old member of the British Parliament. Wilberforce asked Reverend Newton for a secret meeting. When John met him, he couldn't believe that this was Will, sitting in the third row of chairs in the chapel, looking up at him. Wilberforce experienced a new conversion when he met John again. Since this first meeting, many meetings have followed, each time discussing their beliefs and the need for a Christian worldview and values to guide their political decisions. In 1788, when John was 63, Wilberforce came with news that supporters of abolition had finally formed in Parliament. He said, he took the opportunity to publicize our bill through a hearing in Congress. Pastor, please come and testify of the experience of the slave trade as you know. However, there are those who are hostile to our plan. I even ordered assassins to attack me. Wilberforce said more quietly. Pastor, someone came to me today and warned me about my plan to put you on the witness stand. The person seemed to have heard something about the fact that the pastor had not written about in the book. He talked about the pastor's African wife and mixed-race offspring. Newton told Wilberforce. Okay. Because I lived as a servant of Satan. It was far worse than people knew. But that only further supports his claim about the evils of slavery. Pastor, what I'm worried about is Mrs. Newton soon understood what he meant. It was such a terrible thing. Yeah, I can't let Polly go through that. Polly has been feeling very unwell lately. You probably won't be able to stand it. I know. If the pastor cannot testify, I will be very disappointed, but I understand. Newton nodded his head without saying anything. And Wilberforce left. He buried his face in his hands and began to cry. Polly, who didn't know anything, was heartbroken to think of the terrible things that her pure self would face. John Newton pondered the choices before him for days. He hardly slept and was haunted by terrible memories of the past that came to life vividly. He was more than his opponents knew. Satan appeared every night, reminded him of his past, made him question his conversion, and doubt his salvation. But Newton thought that there were numerous reasons God might have abandoned him in the past. But he never did. He quietly meditated on his 25th Psalm and made it a haven. In the halls of St. James's Palace, Reverend John Newton awaited his name to testify. As Prime Minister Pitt guided us into the hearing room, Wilberforce was speaking passionately to the leaders from all walks of life gathered there. I believe that Almighty God has ordained me to accomplish two great goals, the abolition of the slave trade and the moral rearmament of society. I declare to you we will not stop fighting until the traces of this dishonorable slave trade are wiped from our history, until no one believes that it has existed in our country for so long. John heard the Prime Minister introduce himself to the congregation. He rose slowly and began to speak, his voice strong but with humility and authority that had been polished for a long time. The Prime Minister, whom I respect, has given me praise beyond my ability. But I am only the chief of sinners. If it weren't for God's grace, he would have died a long time ago, and even if he was alive, he would be polluting God's world. In fact, to protect me, some people advised me not to come out here today. But, members of Congress, no one can criticize me as loudly as I do. Being able to stand here today is a miracle itself. It is the miracle of forgiveness. Let me explain why slavery must be abolished. Slavery is evil in God's eyes. Even in terms of economic gain, it is wrong. Slavery makes only a very small group of people rich and serves no other class. As many as 15,000 slave ship crew members die at sea each year. Also, that number of slaves are dying. Female slaves and even children are defiled by merchants and sailors. I know because I was one of those demons myself. Newton went on to speak of plunder and raids, extreme torture and oppression, and the horrific acts of violence on slave ships. Gentlemen, I cannot be silent. It is as if God has written a letter of fire in my soul. In the name of God, I ask of you today. Stop the slave trade. You must not allow these evil things to continue. Slavery must be abolished. Because it's the right thing to do. Slavery must be abolished in the empire before it destroys the British Empire. With these words he sat down while the audience in front of him carefully pondered his speech. That night he sat at his desk and looked through his bookshelves. His eyes stopped at the only hymnal which he had published 9 years earlier. Oddly enough, his own writing sometimes had the ability to restore comfort to his soul. He opened a hymn he had written. It was literally autobiographical, and the melody of the hymn was, ironically, an African melody sung by slaves. John closed his eyes and returned to Africa. This time, instead of the nightmarish scenes that haunted him, he remembered the beauty of the land and its people who loved peace. He started humming and singing along to his lyrics.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Was grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed.
Through many dangerous toils and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me on.
When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to see